Alright, so let's get started. Hello everyone. Today we are going to start with lecture number 32 and we will basically be seeing Mill concept on liberty. Alright, but before starting today's lecture, let's see or take a purview of whatever we have done in the previous lecture, that was lecture number 31. So in previous lecture, we have basically started with Mill and his idea or revised version of utilitarianism, where we have basically seen what was the salient feature of utilitarianism by Bentham. And since Mill has come out with his revised version of Bentham's idea of utilitarianism, it becomes also important for us to know the Bentham ideas of utilitarianism. We have seen his major idea of greatest happiness of the greatest number. Okay, so he has given a kind of yardstick for the public policy to the state on the basis of greatest happiness of the greatest number, and he propounded the idea that states should formulate any policy on the basic of that particular idea, that it should have a notion of greatest happiness of greatest number. Then we have seen criticism of Bentham's utilitarianism, which was a major basis for J.S.Mill, who was his student, to build his revised version of what? The utilitarianism. This was the revised edition by Mill of the idea of Bentham's utilitarianism, right? And his basic idea was that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Why? Because he made a qualitative difference between the idea of pleasure and happiness, right? In the case of Bentham, they were one of the same, but in case of Mill, it was not the case, and pleasure and happiness were distinct entity because of their quality of satisfaction. Okay, then we have seen a conclusion, right? So let's, before starting with today's lecture, that is on liberty, let's take a quiz here and see whether you remember the previous concept or not. And if you answer these questions, it is great, applaudable. But if you are not, then go and sincerely watch the previous lecture, because it will help to build your base. All right, so it is very important to have that continuous attention, people, because until and unless you don't have that constant building of basis, you will not be able to remember the concept during your exams and perform well in the PSIR exam, right? Because this optional is becoming very imperative on the basis of conceptual understanding, and until and unless you don't have this conceptual understanding, you are not going to make it. Okay, and with this, let's see this question: which of the following is not true about the Bentham's view of utilitarianism? Here you can pause the video and think about the answer. Okay, which of the following is not the true about Bentham's view of utilitarianism? The option is basically utility should be principle of ethics. Absolutely right. uh, Pleasure is a qualitative term. All right, right. The next option is pleasure can be calculated through fallacious calculation. Again, it is right. The basis of state policy should be greatest happiness of greatest number. This is something which we have seen just now, right? So let's see the answer here. The answer is basically pleasure is a qualitative term, which is wrong in this case. It was not the idea of Bentham, it was the idea of Mills, right? Because Bentham did not take the notion of qualitative difference between his notion of pleasure and happiness. So I'm hoping that you guys are on the track, because less than one people, according to the YouTube analytics, are having the attention span to continue the lecture beyond 5 minutes. And if you are still continuing with the lecture, that shows that you are well on your track to crack the UPSC exam, because in UPSC all it needs is your attention, all it needs is your dedication and your integrity to the subject, right? So with this, let's see the next question: what change did J.S. Mill bring in utilitarianism, right? So we have seen his concept of revised edition on utilitarianism. So here question is, what change or what revision did J.S. Mill bring in utilitarianism? Option A is he postulated there is a difference between pleasure and happiness. He devised a formula to measure pleasure known as fallacious calculation. He said that persons do not differ in quality, and according to him, greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the yardstick of the state policy. Again, you can pause the video, take 10 seconds, and think about the answer. And now let's see an answer. So answer here is basically he postulated that there is a difference between pleasure and happiness, because this is what the first and foremost revision that was made by J.S.Mill. He distinctively differentiated between the idea or notion that is pleasure and happiness. He said that pleasure is more sensual, pleasure is more limited, but happiness is something which a progressive human being always aspire for. That is the more eternal, more what more essential in nature, right? More essential and more eternal in nature. That is why here Mill is thought to be one of the greatest liberal in the history of mankind. All right, so with this, let's get started with today's lecture, that is Mill on liberty. Okay, so Mill on liberty is very important concept, because at the end we will see a question that is critically examine Mill's idea on liberty, right? So for to know or to answer such questions, critically examination, we have to understand the concept of liberty in depth and in what in comprehensibility, right? Then we will be able to answer the question with critical examination. So let's get started. Okay, so let's get started with premise. What is premise? Premise is basically what led Mill to devise his idea on liberty. Okay, so Mill comes out as a champion of liberty to protect the individual from the tyranny of legislative majority dominance and so-called public opinion. Again, from where this particular idea is emerging from, right? So as Mill was the student of Bentham, who propounded the idea of what? Who propounded the idea of the utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism. And according to utilitarianism, he has given the idea of greatest happiness of greatest number. Bentham ने ये आइडिया गवर्नमेंट को दिया एज एन यार्ड स्टिक टू डिवाइस एनी पॉलिसी, एज एन यार्ड स्टिक टू डिवाइस दी गवर्नमेंट पॉलिसी. उसने कहा, बेंथम ने कहा, गवर्नमेंट को ऐसी पॉलिसी बनानी चाहिए जो ऑलवेज विल मैक्सिमाइज द ग्रेटेस्ट हैप्पीनेस ऑफ ग्रेटेस्ट नंबर. बट क्या हुआ, इन्होंने बेंथम ने जब ये पॉलिसी गवर्नमेंट को दी और उन्होंने एक लेजिस्लेचर बनाने का आइडिया फॉर्मुलेट किया या प्रोपाउंड किया, इनिशियली तो the process was very efficient, the process was good, it was working on the principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number. But gradually what started to happen is that the legislature or the power of legislature converted into tyranny of legislature. What is tyranny of legislature? Tyranny of legislature is basically a few people in power started controlling the majority of the people who were governed by this legislator, right? So gradually the legislator or democracy converted into majoritarianism, right? And this is why Mill was concerned about the idea of utilitarianism and so-called public opinion, right? So let's see this idea in greater depth. So basically in his work that is On Liberty, which was published in 1859, Mill sought to demonstrate the danger to which individual liberty was exposed in a democracy, right? So again, the idea of democracy emerged from the idea of utilitarianism by the Bentham, right? Where he given up power to legislator to have a rule over the people of that particular state. But gradually, as I have already told you, the power started being converted into tyranny and majoritarianism. Mill, in his work that is On Liberty, he was concerned about the danger to which individual liberty was exposed in a democracy, right? तो बेसिक फंडा क्या है यहाँ पे, ग्रेजुअली तो बेंथम ने एक लेजिस्लेचर इस्टेब्लिश करने का आइडिया दिया, राइट, कि देयर शुड बी अ लेजिस्लेचर which should work on the principle of greatest happiness of greatest number, right? This should be a kind of DPSP, right? DPSP that we have in today's constitution, which is a kind of directive principle to the state that government should act as per the DPSP which is being formulated or which is being enshrined in the constitution. So it is this formula by Bentham was kind of DPSP to the legislature of their time. They said that government should always aspire or keep in mind the greatest happiness of the greatest principle or utilitarianism philosophy while formulating any policy, right? But gradually what started happening is that समय के साथ ये होने लग गया, ये greatest happiness of greatest number basically happiness of मेजोरिटेरियन मेजोरिटेरियन सेंटिमेंट्स को रिप्रेजेंट करने लग गया, राइट? सो ग्रेटेस्ट हैप्पीनेस ऑफ द ग्रेटेस्ट नंबर पूरे स्टेट को छोड़ के सिर्फ कुछ चंद लोग जो पावर में थे उनमें लिमिटेड होने लग गया। जो लोग लिमिटेड लोग पावर में थे, अगर उनको कोई चीज अच्छा लग रहा होता है तो उनको लगता है ये पूरे स्टेट के लिए भी बेनिफिशियल है, राइट? So this is how the democracy got converted into tyranny or majority, right? Or majoritarianism, where the greatest happiness of greatest number is basically limited to the people who were in power in legislature. If they were finding something suitable, if they were finding something good, then they were thinking that it is also good for the state at large, which was not the case, right? And directly or indirectly it was somewhere bringing the idea or liberty of the state at large at danger. It is posing vulnerability to the people who are the part of the state at large, and this is how Mill demonstrated the danger to which individual liberty was exposed in a democracy. All right, so Mill believed that in present form of democracy the rule of all does not mean the rule of all, right? As I have already told you, the rule of all does not mean rule of each man by himself, right? So the rule of all, right? Basically democracy is the idea of rule of all, right? Rule of all. This is what is the fundamental notion of democracy. But here मिल का कंसर्न ये है कि एक्चुअल जो डेमोक्रेसी इवोल्यूशन हो रहा था, डेमोक्रेसी जैसे जैसे आगे बढ़ रहा था, वहां पे जो रूल ऑफ ऑल है वो रूल ऑफ ईच मैन रिप्रेजेंट नहीं कर रहा था, वो बेसिकली रूल ऑफ फ्यू पीपल हु वेयर होल्डिंग द पावर वो रिप्रेजेंट कर रहा था। वो सारे स्टेट का विल रिप्रेजेंट नहीं कर रहा था, वो सिर्फ कुछ लोग जो पावर होल्ड कर रहे हैं उनका विल रिप्रेजेंट कर रहा था, राइट? बेसिकली एक एग्जांपल मैं आपको देने की कोशिश करूं सिंपल, तो क्या होता है, लेट्स से हम ग्रुप ऑफ 10 फ्रेंड्स हैं, राइट? ग्रुप ऑफ 10 फ्रेंड्स हैं। अगर 10 फ्रेंड्स में ये 4 लोग बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट और एक इंपॉर्टेंट रोल होल्ड करते हैं, राइट? तो कुछ टाइम बाद इनिशियली ये लोग सबका पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू तो लेते हैं, बट ग्रेजुअली क्या होने लग जाता है, जो ये 4 लोग सोचते हैं इनको लगने लग जाता है कि सब हम जो भी कहेंगे वो अग्री करेंगे, राइट? वो सब जो हम सोच रहे हैं वैसा सभी सोचेंगे, ऐसा वो सोचने लग जाते हैं। बट दिस इज नॉट एक्चुअली द केस, right? This is not actually the case. Why? Because men have their unique will. Men have their unique will. And what is the consequences of this rule of all does not mean rule of each member by himself? It is basically hampering the liberty of the people, right? People in a particular state, right? This is why Mill was concerned about, right? So some people rule the others. In democracy, some people rule the others. This is the basic idea of what representative democracy. Representative democracy, where some people they represent the entire state. Again, what is commonly known as the will of the people is in practice the will of the majority, right? So here, let's say take an example of India itself, right? Here हम क्या करते हैं, हम अपने ऑनेबल पीएम साहब को, कैब काउंसिल ऑफ मिनिस्टर्स, इनको हम अपनी विल दे के रिप्रेजेंट तो कर देते हैं, राइट? रिप्रेजेंट तो कर लेते हैं, बट क्या होता है, जो मोस्ट ऑफ द टाइम इनकी पॉलिसीज होती है, क्या हम इनसे अपने आप को कॉन्फर्म करते हैं? क्या हमें उनकी हर पॉलिसी सही लगती है? नहीं, क्योंकि ग्रेजुअली कुछ टाइम बाद ये बहुत ज़्यादा पॉलिटिकल ड्रिवन आइडियोलॉजी से ड्रिवन करने लग जाते हैं। इन्हें जो भी सही लगता है देश के लिए वो करने लग जाते हैं, इर्रेस्पेक्टिव वो सबके लिए सही है या नहीं, वो माइनॉरिटी को इंक्लूसिव, माइनॉरिटीज के लिए इंक्लूसिव है या नहीं, राइट। रिसेंटली फार्म लॉस आया था जो भी काफी ज्यादा लाइक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट लेके आया हमारे देश में। जो लोग सेंटर में बैठे थे दे फेल्ट गुड अबाउट इट, लाइक इट विल हैव positive impact in the society or in the country. And despite having positive consequence, positive result or not, it might have had some positive impact as well, that is undeniable, but it was under huge controversy, right? Because it was not taking the interest of the important lobby that were the farmers. And how can someone who don't have any idea about the mode of operation or modus operandi of the most important lobby can decide something such important like the farm laws, right? So this is something which Mill was concerned about. So gradually यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है, the will of the state or will of the people is basically the will of the majority. इनको जो सही लग रहा है वो कर रहे हैं, thinking or taking into the consideration the idea that कि this is also for the betterment of people, right? But we never know in reality whether it is really better for, or it promote the welfare among the citizens or not, right? So this is something which was concerning Mill. The will of minority is neglected in democracy, right? Will of minority, right? In case I have just mentioned about the farm laws, like the farmers laws and etc., which was in the case of the farm bills, right? That is why it was later on repealed by his honorable prime minister of our country himself, right? So this is what was the major problem or concern about which led Mill to talk or articulate his idea on liberty, right? He was concerned about the liberty of individual or each person in the state, which were basically governed by the democracy, which were converting itself into a tyranny or the majoritarian dominance, right? So with this premise led Mill to formulate his idea on liberty. Okay. So this shortcoming of democracy is deplorable, but it is the fact, and democracy must be saved from it, right? It is the fact, and this is what we see in today's representative democracy most of the time, right? And hence the democracy must be saved from it, because democracy's true fundamental idea is that democracy is basically will of the people. It is a representation of will of the people, and will of the people is never equal to the will of the majority, right? It can never be equal to will of the majority, because we don't know from where this particular majority is coming, this whether this majority is actually representative or not. Just for the sake of representing or giving someone that responsibility, we are choosing among the options that we have, right? We are just choosing among the options we have. Even in our electoral politics, we are just voting among the options we have. We don't actually have the right or have the idea of uh, operating or working on our own will. We are not expecting a politician should be like that and like that. Whatever option we are getting, we are just choosing among them, right? So that is why the shortcoming of this particular idea in democracy is something of which the democracy itself must be saved from, right? So Mill says whenever there is an ascendant class, what is ascendant class? A class which is being rising, right? The class which is being rising for what? For majority. The class which is being rising for majority. A large portion of the morality of the country emanates from its class interest and its feeling of the class superiority, right? So idea whatever idea or ideology that is prevailing in that particular country is kind of ideology which is emanating or which is coming out from this ascending class, right? Ascending class. So that This is the idea from where the entire notion of left wing, right wing, centrist, and etc. comes from, right? Whenever any, let's say in today's government, there is a right wing which is in power, right? The right wing, right? The present party basically. So here, whatever ideology or whatever morality that a country will have, let's say of capitalism, promotion of capitalism, the idea of Hindutva, right? This etc. These are basically the morality or notion or ideology of this ascending class, right? This ascending class. This is how Mill is trying to propound the idea. The idea is not basically here. Mill is wanting to say the idea is not basically a will of the entire people, will of each man. It is not, the idea of morality is not inclusive. It is basically the idea or morality of the class which is representing that particular country, right? Because that particular idea emanates or it being produced from the interest and its feeling of the class superiority, right? So this is the idea. So Mill denounces both the tyranny of opinion and superiority of class. Mill is strongly against tyranny of opinion. What is tyranny of opinion? That the opinion of majority, or the opinion which is being which is being surfacing from the ascending class should not be imposed upon the minority, this is what Mill is talking about. So Mill basically denounces both tyranny of opinion and superiority of class. Why? Because in representative government there will always be chances of exploitation where the majority will start exploiting the minority. Why? Because they are in power, right? And as per the Indian context of Matsya law, we all know that there is general tendency of big fish big fish eating the smaller one, big fish generally eating the smaller one, right? And this is the idea which is being denounced by Mill, right? The tyranny of opinion and superiority of class. In a real democracy, both this must not be allowed to prevail, right? And this is the standard which is being given by the Mill, that in real democracy this must not be allowed to prevail. Why? Because it will lead to the denouncement or complete negation of democracy, the fundamental of democracy, which is basically the will of the people, right? If something like this is happening, it is against the basis or the fundamental of democracy, right? And this is why Mill is strongly arguing that this must not be allowed to prevail in any democracy. Mill defends liberty of individual to ensure fullest development of his personality, right? So Mill again is advocating the idea that liberty is the basis, right? Even in our Indian constitution, we have right to liberty. Why we have right to liberty? Because it is the way, or it is the means to reach the fullest potential of our personality. Without our liberty, we ought not to reach the truest potential of our personality. That is why liberty becomes the birthright of the individual. This is what is the idea of which the J.S. Mill is epitome, right? Epitome. This idea even these days are being enshrined in our modern day democratic constitutions. Right to liberty, right? It is among one of the very important right, that is the golden triangle, right? The article 14, 19, and 21: equality, freedom, and liberty, and right to life. These are the heart and soul of our Indian constitution, right? Because without right to liberty, one will not develop the fullest of his personality, right? So he identifies the major areas in which liberty of an individual must be protected, right? So he is basically giving a major area, right? Major areas in which the liberty of individual must be protected. So let's see what are the major areas about which Mill is talking about. So first idea or the first area which Mill is saying that this must be protected at all costs is freedom of thought and expression, right? Freedom of thought and expression. What it is? Mill believed that freedom of thought and expression belongs to individuals' inward domain of consciousness. Very true. Inward domain of consciousness. Why? Because the thoughts and expression are the product of one's consciousness, right? It is the product of our reason. And if our liberty shall be hindered or shall be liberated or shall be limited on thought and expression, then there will be higher likeliness that we will not be able to reach the full potential of the reason, a development of the reason, right? So this is the idea which freedom which Mill is talking about when it comes to liberty on freedom of thought and expression, right? And here is also one idea about Mill's life which comes, right, in his early of childhood. Mill was strongly hindered by his father. His father, he was asked to strictly follow whatever was said by his father. He was not allowed to go to the school. He was not allowed to do whatever his peers were engaging during their age, right? And this had kind of very negative impact on Mill's later life, where at one upon a time he even had to go through the mental health issues like depression. And this is why he strongly advocates the idea of freedom of thought and expression, right? Because if it is not given, then it will lead to the underdevelopment of reason, consciousness, right? So this is the idea which is being propounded, right? So Mill asserts that it is illegitimate for state to interfere with the liberty of thought and expression. He is saying it is illegitimate for state to interfere. Okay, he assumes that it is to the advantage of mankind that knowledge should increase among and must be possessed by as many of them as possible, right? Why he is saying that knowledge should increase among and must be possessed by as many as of them as possible? Why? Because it is the thing only thing which will lead any nation to prosper, right? It is the only thing which will lead any nation to prosper. And this is basically coming from the time of or the age of literature, right? As we know how Europe was the epicenter of literature, the best literature of the world. And this was something which the Europeans were very much possessed about. And this is why Mill also advocates the idea that it is in advantage of mankind that knowledge should increase among and must be possessed by as many of them as possible. Right? Again, he was seeing the era of science, technology, IR, right? And hence it all were the result of what? The growing knowledge, right? The increased possession of knowledge. And hence he is saying it is illegitimate for the state to interfere with the liberty of thought and expression, because it will lead to the subsidence of the knowledge, right? And hence it will never lead a state to prosper in harmony and welfaric manner, right? So this was all about his idea of freedom of thought and expression. Okay, so So this was the first major area, that was freedom of thought and expression, where Mill sought absolute liberty in order to develop the reason in individual. Okay, so in next lecture we will be seeing his concept of harm principle, which is very important. Okay, we will also see some of the criticism, and we will also have a practice question. With this, let's end today's lecture, and I'm hoping that you guys are having a good time, and thank you for watching.